everybody, it's Eric Pappenfuss. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day. We're here at the Collectibles building at Midtown Scholar. And today, Amanda, I want to talk about memory and the American Revolution. Why? Well, because several really interesting books came in that were written about the Revolution by protagonists in the American Revolution, but they were written 20 or 30 years after the fact. So we begin to see how memories change. And I have one book written by a loyalist and one book written by a patriot. And I thought it'd be interesting to compare them. All right. Now, these books just came in from an auction up in Connecticut. I think they came from the same collector. And let's get right to it. The first book, Amanda, was written by a loyalist. And in this case, he's a very famous loyalist by the name of Jonathan Boucher. And it's called A View of the Cause and Consequences of the American Revolution, published in London in 1797. So we're looking about 20 years after the fact. And Boucher is famous partly because he ran a school in Annapolis, Maryland, where he taught, among other people, the stepson of George Washington. Now, George Washington had a son it was Martha Washington's son when he married Martha from her previous marriage. Thus, his stepson in the Custis family. John Parke Custis was the name of the stepson. And what's interesting about Washington's relationship with his stepson is usually the American revolutionaries are cast as sort of like prodigal children, and they're the radicals. But Washington was a little different. He really wanted to bring up his stepson with conservative values, with all the great indoctrination that he could. And he went to Boucher, who was an Anglican minister who ran this school, and his letters back and forth to Boucher just constantly complained about his poor stepson. Wasn't studying hard enough, wasn't good with money, didn't have the work ethic or the values that Washington wanted to see. Now, Boucher is really interesting because he believes in the divine right of kings. He gets along really well with Washington. He agrees about Custis, the son, but he doesn't get along with his congregation in Annapolis as it gets closer and closer to the American Revolution. Why? Well, because he writes sermons that say things like, "As long as I live, I will proclaim God save the king." And this was one of his final sermons. In fact, his farewell sermon before he had to be escorted out of the church at gunpoint. Oh. Yes, Boucher is famous because he kept a loaded pistol in his pulpit. That's pretty interesting. But no, he had to flee. He could not handle it. Now, but what's interesting is that after the Revolution, Boucher looks at the early United States and the young nation. He looks at Washington and he thinks, well, maybe I was wrong about the American Revolution, because honestly, George Washington is really everything I have to admire. And he dedicates this book, Amanda, to George Washington, Esquire. Isn't that cool?
Yeah.
And so this is 1797. Washington has just finished his term as president. And he says things like, "I was once your neighbor and your friend. The unhappy dispute which terminated in the disunion of our respective countries also broke off our personal connection. But I never was more than your political enemy. And every sentiment, even a political animosity, has on my part long ago subsided." And he says, and by the way, you can't just retire to public life. You're as good as a king. You've got to stay and run things. And Boucher looks at federal America and believes the Federalists really are the right inheritors of the American Revolution, and maybe there's a rapprochement that can happen 20 years later. Pretty neat, right?
Yeah.
Before we get to the other book, let me just tell you one interesting fact about poor Custis, George Washington's stepson. He dies during the American Revolution, but he does marry against his stepfather's wishes, has several children, and his granddaughter will eventually marry Robert E. Lee. So there's a direct connection between the Custis family and the American Civil War as well. All right. Our second book is related to that same Lee family because it is a history of the American Revolution, one of the earliest histories of the American Revolution, written, in fact, by one of the participants, and that was Light Horse Harry Lee, General Harry Lee, who fought in the American Revolution. Now, if you look at this book, Amanda, you'll see it was bound at the time it came out. So this came out in 1810. So now we're about 30 years after the American Revolution. It was bound and owned by John Francis Mercer. Mercer was former governor of Maryland. He was a cavalry officer in the American Revolution who fought alongside Lee, and he is exactly the type of person who you would think would own such a book. He obviously cherished the book. There's his book plate. That's the Mercer family book plate. And you can see as you get into the book that basically it's Light Horse Harry Lee's memoirs, especially about the Southern campaign. So there's a lot on Nathaniel Greene and a lot on the eventual leading up to the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown. Now, I bought this book at an auction because I knew who John Francis Mercer was. I knew that he was a former Maryland governor who also had opposed the U.S. Constitution. He was a Jeffersonian, a friend of Thomas Jefferson, and that was enough to make it interesting to me. I didn't know the extent of Mercer's involvement in the Revolution until I began reading some of the letters that I found in Volume 2. And believe it or not, Amanda, this book is extra illustrated with a whole series of letters that were written to John Francis Mercer from a gentleman by the name of Charles Sims. Now, the letters have sort of fallen apart now, but they're all there, and you can reconstruct them. And when I describe this book and put it up online, I'm going to put up transcripts of the letters so that people can read them. But Charles Sims, who would go on to become mayor of Alexandria, was also a cavalry officer, also cited in Lee's memoirs. And he was acting as an intermediary at the time for Lee to get the accounts of other people that served in the Continental Army. And part of the reason, one of the things that you find out in the letters is that Sims does not identify who it is that's writing his memoirs. He says, I've got a friend, he's writing his memoirs, the American Revolution. He's got a few questions for you. Could you answer these questions? And then he asks a series of questions. Now, Mercer might not have answered the questions if he knew it was coming from Lee, because Mercer was a Jeffersonian and Lee was a Federalist. And so the fact that there's an intermediary is very interesting. Mercer, by the way, serves as the aide-de-camp for a different Lee. He serves as the aide-de-camp for Charles Lee of Hamilton the Musical fame.
Sure.
And he resigns his commission after Lee is court-martialed, but then eventually comes back and serves in the cavalry with Nathaniel Greene under Lafayette. So Mercer's very important, has an awful lot to say, is still defending Charles Lee at the time. And it's just a very interesting series of letters that then obviously Mercer bound into his copy of this book in Volume 2. There might have been some letters in Volume 1, but they haven't survived. A couple interesting things, Amanda. In this book, Lee really gives it to Jefferson. He says that Jefferson is responsible for the failure to defend Virginia. And Jefferson absolutely hates this book when it comes out in 1810. Let's go to the title page so you can see the title page again. This is now the title page for Volume 2, taking us through the surrender with Cornwallis. Now it's 1812. You know what happens in 1812 for Volume 2, the War of 1812. Right. And now Lee, the great patriot of the American Revolution, is on the side of the British, in that he no longer believes that we should be going to war in the War of 1812, and he's pretty much a committed pacifist at this point in time who is pro-Britain. There is one more interesting thing about the letters. The letters have some details in them that I don't think have ever before come to light, that have to do with the surrender of Tarleton to the American and French troops after the Battle of Yorktown. And Tarleton was the great British cavalry commander who was renowned for his brutal treatment of the Americans. And the letters talk about how, in fact, Tarleton was afraid he would be killed if he if he was handed over to the Americans, and instead needed a French intermediary. Anyhow, back to Jefferson. When this book comes out, I love it. Jefferson writes James Monroe. This is what he says. He says, "The lying Lee has put all those imputations among the romances of his historical novel for the amusement of credulous and uninquisitive readers." Wow. That's a pretty good blurb for a back of a book, isn't it? Absolutely hates the book. Lee, by the way, he goes to Maryland to defend a Maryland newspaper editor who is a Federalist by the name of Alexander Conti Hansen, who's publishing these pacifist, don't get involved in the War of 1812 editorials. And you know what happens to poor Lee at the same time this comes out? He gets dragged out of the newspaper offices by a Baltimore mob, which is why Baltimore is called Mob Town today, and is beaten up to the point of death and eventually dies from his traumatic injuries. He tries to go down to Barbados to nurse himself back to health, but never does and doesn't recover. So the sad story about Lee, the Federalist, who was in favor of the British at the time, switching sides against the Jeffersonians, and Mercer was a devoted advocate of Jefferson, so probably would have never written his account if he had known it was going to Lee. So pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Now there is one more hidden thing in this book. And the best part about the book, Amanda, is that it was not noticed by the auction house, which did identify it as being by John Francis Mercer, but didn't mention the signature, which I'm about to show you in the book. And the signature is worth more than the book, because Light Horse Harry Lee, at the time of the mob, had a young son who was about 5 years old, didn't really know his father, never got to know his father, and that son was Robert E. Lee. And this book is actually signed by Robert E. Lee, which is pretty amazing. Now, a Robert E. Lee signature on its own is worth several $1,000s. It's like a Lincoln signature in terms of collectability. So it's actually, the signature there is actually worth more than the letters and more than the book. But of course, you've got to sell these things together. You can't take it apart. Maybe, you know, the manuscripts appeal to a manuscript historian, the signature appeals to a Civil War person, the book appeals to book person, but actually the story is all intertwined. And there's one more coda for Lee. Lee never writes his own memoirs, but he does read his father's memoirs. And we know that because at the end of the Civil War, he chooses to publish one book, and that book is a reprint of his father's memoirs with an introduction by Robert E. Lee. And the introduction talks about his father's life and basically talks about all the good aspects of his father's life, doesn't mention any of the bad aspects, such as he was in debtor's prison when he was writing these memoirs to begin with back in 1810, before he got out and got dragged out by that mob. Lee never really came to terms with his father, and he spends his whole life sort of trying to grapple with who his father was and what the legacy of his father was, and that's why these memoirs really are so important, because it's the only way the young boy got to know his father and got to understand the meaning of the American Revolution, and then it's, of course, its relation to the American Civil War. Pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, these were great stories, amazing books, came from the same auction, probably came from the same collector, given the Lee family connections to Custis and others. And we're going to end with a funny book. And Amanda, I have to say, this funny book, also recently discovered, is an all-time classic. Yes. In fact, it's one of the few that I'm going to say is not for sale and will just be on display in the bookcase of the Scholar as being one of the great titles ever for a book of American history.
Amazing.
Okay? Now, in order to understand the title, you just need to know one little thing, which is that the floodplain in the Mississippi River, in the northern part of the Mississippi River, is sometimes called the American Bottoms. And the book, which is a wonderful series of archaeological essays, is happily entitled, that's right, Archaeology in the American Bottom.
Oh,
yes!
No.
The worst titled academic treatise in the history of funny books. I can't think of anything. Can you think of anything else that compares with Archaeology in the American
It's
Bottom?
up there with Dirt Holes.
It's that good.
Yeah.
So this book you will have to come and pay homage to in our funny bookcase in the Scholar, located on the American history floor. If you want to read more about those Lee's letters, go to eBay and you can see the transcriptions, and I'll put them all up together. I thank you for watching, and I hope you'll watch next week and every week, Fridays at noon, for more adventures in the world of books.